Welcome to the New Mexico News Podcast, headlines and stories from the land of enchantment. Brought to you by KRQE. Here's Chris McKee and Gabrielle Burkhart.
This week's topic hits home for me, and if you're listening from New Mexico, statistics show that you or someone in your circle will likely relate to this topic as well. Let's get straight to our guest. Joining me in studio today, thanks for being here, Mickey Kivitz. You're the new Director of Education at the Grief Center here in Albuquerque, right?
I am, yeah. Thanks for having me here. I haven't even been there 2 months, so it's very brand new.
Yeah. And if you aren't familiar, the Grief Center, for our listeners, is a local nonprofit that provides free support groups, workshops, resources for grieving children, teens, and adults. And you're in a newly created position, as we just mentioned, what used to be called the Children's Grief Center. That's when I started getting to know what this facility was. I didn't know that it existed until I experienced my own loss, full disclosure, and found it, as a resource in 2017. So again, disclosure, I've been involved with the Grief Center since about 2017, started there as a volunteer bereavement facilitator that year. But we're here to talk about your new role and position. What does this mean for students and grieving children in New Mexico? You come from a teaching background, so I want to hear about that. First, tell me what drew you to teaching and ultimately led you into this position that you're in today?
Yeah, great questions. First, it's great to hear that you were a volunteer bereavement facilitator. When I started my teaching career in 2015, I had just finished graduate school at UNM. I was in a biomedical sciences graduate program and wanted to do something that was more involved with people, and teaching was a natural outlet for that. And that same year in 2015, I started as a volunteer bereavement facilitator myself. The Grief Center is amazing. All of the skills that you learn there are so helpful. So I would be teaching of the day and then twice a month go and be a bereavement facilitator, and was just so drawn to the work that you get to do and how you learn how to listen to people and how you learn how to support them. It was one of the best experiences I've ever had. And because of that, when they offered me the new role to be Director of Education, I leapt at it. Just last May, I was teaching. I was a middle school special ed teacher. I got my 1 week break and then started this new job, and I love it. It's the most fun I've had in a job, which is weird to say because it's at the Grief Center, but I just have so many good things to share about the work that we do there.
Yeah. And let's talk about that. Some of the data in New Mexico, our state ranks second highest in the nation for childhood bereavement, meaning an estimated 1 out of 7 youth will experience the death of a parent or a sibling before graduating high school. And, as far as children that the Grief Center serves, I know just in the last year, more than half of the people served at the Grief Center reported losing a father. Mickey, you've worked with a lot of the population that we're talking about. Why do you think those statistics are so staggering here in New Mexico?
It can be disheartening to know we're second in the nation in childhood bereavement, like you mentioned. We're also first in the nation in violent crime, and we're last in the nation in education. And from my standpoint, it seems like such a natural thing to want to help grieving kids, because when students are experiencing grief, and no matter which school I've been at as a teacher, I've seen bereaved students. Those students have trouble focusing. They have a lot of emotions that they need help processing. They're very lonely. All of that impacts their education. And to me, knowing all of these facts and the statistics that are out there just makes me hopeful that we could lead the nation in healing. It's mostly that we have the most opportunity to help people who are bereaved. We have 2 grief centers in New Mexico. I'm fortunate to be at the Grief Center in Albuquerque, and I'm doing a lot of community outreach and talking to schools, and especially trying to help teens. That's our mission, is just helping grieving people, but especially helping grieving kids.
Anecdotally or statistically, why is it though that, when you look at those stats, more than half of children lose a father here in New Mexico?
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to traumatic loss. Oftentimes, the children who show up at the Grief Center with their adults are dealing with a sudden loss. It was something that may have been violent. It was something that was very quick and abrupt, and those can lead to the most stress responses that kids have. I wish I knew a way to fix these things, but I don't. but I do know ways to talk with kids who are hurting, and I know ways to help others learn how to talk to people who are hurting. At the Grief Center, anybody can be a part of it. We're a volunteer-based organization. Like you mentioned, we're a nonprofit, meaning that our owners are the New Mexico community. So we have a board that hopefully reflects the diversity of New Mexico. But we're a community-supported organization that, just like you and me, anybody can be a part of, and the skills that you learn there transfer to all aspects of your life, and it just helps you communicate and understand how people are dealing with their lives day to day.
Yeah, and we know in rural parts of New Mexico, it's even harder, and there are fewer resources in places, that are further away from the metro here. As the director of education in this new role, what does that mean exactly? How will you interface with the community outside of Albuquerque?
Really good question. I was just in Roswell last week. When people go to our website, it's griefnm.org. They can see the trainings that are given. I do have a series of webinars that I'm providing that will reach anybody, even people outside of New Mexico. They're free. But I get to drive to communities and physically be present with people who request trainings from us. So last week I was talking to counselors and therapists in Roswell at an organization called Casa Kids, which they specialize in child advocacy. But I'm hoping to reach places like Farmington, Las Cruces, Silver City, any place that has a need and needs grief resources. I am able in my position to drive, bring resources, deliver trainings, and especially the trainings for schools and staff are really helpful because a lot of schools don't teach about grief. Oftentimes, if things are going well, have to teach about it, but it's something that grief is really inclusive. It's something that does not discriminate. Grief finds all of us in its own ways. And I don't know how best to describe it other than when you experience grief, the need for support is always there. And children are resilient, but it doesn't mean that they have to do it alone. So I feel very fortunate in my position. I can go and directly talk with communities that need help. And I hope that people will hear our conversation and know that this is one more resource that New Mexicans have.
So will you be actually physically driving to schools and you provide counselors with training, or what does that look like?
We're all figuring that out right now. There's no one way to do this work. This week, I've gotten 3 or 4 emails. And if you email us at info@griefnm.org, you could request to have somebody come and speak to you from the Grief Center. I am just hoping to connect with as many teachers and as many counselors and therapists and social workers throughout the state as I can. I am doing cold calling. I am reaching out to see, do you have any needs? Is there something that I can help provide? Is there a need that I can address? And if they call me, that's even better because I'm already ready to go visit them.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Podcast.
KRQE News 13 investigations. One of the biggest cons in New Mexico history. How did they get away with it?
Well, they had an accomplice. The state of New Mexico.
A road rage encounter leads to murder.
I miss him every single day.
Did the judicial system fail here?
New Mexico's families, homes, and lives are left in ashes.
There's a level of anxiety.
FEMA has been an abject and abysmal failure.
Watch anytime on krqe.com or our YouTube channel.
And to be clear, you and I were not certified counselors or social workers, but the Grief Center does work with, those professionals as well. They offer facilitator training, so bereavement facilitator training, which is what you and I both went through, right? And so one of the subjects that's always brought up in those trainings are misconceptions about grief. And I want to ask you about that. What do you see as some of the main misconceptions out there, especially as it relates to, talking about death and grief with children?
Yeah. Have you ever heard about the 5 stages of grief?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you understand about those? Like because a lot of people have misconceptions based on those. Like what do you think those are, if I can turn it to you?
Yeah. Well, just kind of a run the gamut of emotions, right? Anger. You have different responses to grief. And what I learned is that everybody kind of grieves differently, right? Like your grief might look a lot different than mine or a 5-year-old's or an 11-year-old's, depending on the circumstances. And so, yeah, the stages are kind of like, in my head, a little bit of a roller coaster that you go through emotionally.
Yeah, that was really well said. So Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, you're good.
So the 5 stages of grief are a misnomer. They're truly the 5 stages of dying for a specific subset of populations. There was a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who wrote a book on death and dying. It was published in the late 1960s. She was an amazing advocate for people, and she was a feminist, and she worked with cancer patients, and she noticed that when cancer patients got the news that chemotherapy wasn't working anymore, that they would process in typical stages that she observed. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance were what she identified. And that was specifically for people who are no longer receiving chemotherapy and on their way to their life being over. And it has been extrapolated to other places. Some people think of it as the 5 stages of grief. But in truth, there's no one way to grieve, like you said. There's no 5 stages that we go through when we lose a loved one. We go through many different emotions. They are dynamic. They change constantly. They can be very extreme. They can be internalized. They can be externalized. Grief is a really messy thing. There's no clean way for grief to proceed. And I think that it's helpful to know that, because if you feel like you're grieving the wrong way, that adds another layer of emotions you have to deal with. But knowing that there's no one way to grieve, I think helps everybody. And I'm so glad that you went through the bereavement facilitator training, because the more people that go through that, the more we can build a community that's grief informed.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has always struck me is just, you know, when you go through that training and you learn how to be a better listener, how to be a better communicator with students and children, kids can see through a lie, right? Part of it is just being honest with young students and kids. And, you know, kids can probably understand a lot more than adults give them credit for. So, you know, losing trust through dishonesty is a serious thing to consider when you're communicating with a child, I think, right? And obviously age appropriate is important. Your conversations may look different to a 5-year-old versus an 11-year-old. But for someone listening who just may not even know how to broach the subject when, you know, someone dies, or when you're addressing grief with a child, if you're, you know, a school counselor or maybe a teacher or just somebody volunteering with kids, what would be some tips or resources that you can offer?
I think that when we meet people where they are, and especially starting from ourselves and just telling someone, I don't quite know how to say this, I'm going to try, is a great start. Everyone does better with the truth. Children can handle the truth, and saying words like dead and died and dying are not bad words. Those are really helpful words. There's an appropriate time to use them, and it is the most appropriate time when someone has died to use those words. But I think as adults, we have this fear that we're going to make it worse for them somehow. But telling them the truth helps them. It does not make it worse. It makes it consumable and palatable, so that when they hear this news and have their reaction, they can have a genuine, authentic reaction. And it's not our job to make them feel better. It's not our job to take away their pain. If anything, we cause harm when we try and take away their pain. So if we deliver the news that somebody has died, and we're present with a child, and we let them ask questions and experience their emotions, we're doing the best thing we can for them. We often say things as adults to try and make children feel better in all different ways. Like, we want the best for our children. And when it comes to grief, the best thing for your child is to be able to have a genuine response and feel all the feelings. And it's like, it makes sense. Like, you just got the worst news of your life. You're going to feel bad for a while. Kids are really resilient, though. And when they couple that resilience with the support that we give them, healing happens. And there's a lot of healing that occurs after you lose someone, because it's a big wound. All wounds need time to heal. And that healing happens with experience, with love, with support. And if you can provide those things in a way that makes sense for your heart, the other person is going to recognize that, and they're going to connect with you. And I think that that's a beautiful thing that we can all do and we can all offer. And it's okay to need some support as adults, because everybody deserves support.
I want to unpack this just a little bit, because I've seen this pretty recently in real life, where, you know, a grandmother was talking with her child, an elementary age student, about, you know, the loss of a cousin, and she asked, where is he? And the grandmother responded very lovingly, and like you said, I think everybody comes at it with the best intentions, but she said, oh, he went on a trip. And, you know, telling a child that the person just went on a vacation or a trip and then maybe there's confusion that you'll deal with later. Why do you think it is important to be honest with a young child?
When you tell a child the truth, they are able to figure out what makes sense and what does not make sense. It's so common to tell people, well, they're in a better place. They went to heaven. They went on a trip. And for children, this may mean, wait, you mean they abandoned me? They went on a trip without me? Like, if they're in heaven, can I go there? I read a story recently that there was a child who was told, you know, your sibling died, and they went to heaven because that's where all the good boys go. And this child reacted by getting quiet, but when he would go to church, he would act out and he'd be naughty. And when asked about this later on, he said, well, I'm not ready to die yet. I don't want to go yet. If all good boys go to heaven, then I need to be a bad boy here. And that's a normal, common way for them to interpret this. I mean, children between the ages of 5 and 7 start to finally understand that death is a permanent thing. Children before that age don't understand that. Like, I've heard stories of 4-year-olds hearing about the death of a father, for example, and they'll process it and they'll cry, and then they'll say, but is dad coming to my birthday party? Kids need to know that adults can process this information and communicate it because we're modeling for them. And if we cause confusion, which is really normal and it's really common, we have the opportunity to help them understand by being truthful with ourselves that their body died. It's nothing that you did that was wrong. Their heart isn't beating. They're not feeling anything, which for us can elicit a lot of emotions. For a child, like hearing the words that they died and their body is not in any pain anymore is helpful, because children will blame themselves and think that they somehow did something to cause this. And we can help them understand that you didn't do anything wrong. Yes, I miss them too. How should we honor them today? What should we do so that your feelings are okay? Because when I get really big feelings, like, I get dysregulated too. But I do something with them. Like, what do you want to do? And then all of a sudden the child is empowered and they're still hurting, but they're able to process their grief in a really healthy way.
And, you know, there are social workers and chaplains who also work with the Grief Center. Tell me about some of the programs and trainings that the Grief Center provides for folks like that in New Mexico. And how are these services, if someone's curious, how are they able to be free for families?
Oh, really good question. So the Grief Center is a nonprofit organization. We do get state funding. We work very hard to make sure that our volunteers are taken care of. You and I were volunteers there. You are able to receive this training for free because the Grief Center removes as many impediments as it can so that people are able to show up. So cost is often a prohibitive thing, especially when it comes to seeking help. So when someone attends programs, for example, on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday night at 5:30, we make sure that we feed them. We give them free meals through Dion's, and it's great. And for some families, that's the first time that they've sat together and had a meal since the death of a loved one. Our programs are free because volunteers are able to come and facilitate these groups for them. But we are able to make money from our Healing Hearts campaign, from donations, from state funding, and we want to provide as many services as we can. So there's some things that I'm working on as Director of Education to improve the outreach of our programs, because they make such a big difference when people are seeking help and they receive that help.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Podcast.
Kirky Cares Shoes for Kids is KRQE's biggest initiative of the year. And get this, we don't just go and give a couple of shoes here and there. We go into 10 Title I schools each year, and every single student in that school will get a brand new pair of shoes. We've given out more than 30,000 pairs of new shoes, and it's easy to donate. Go to kirkycares.com and hit the donate button.
Talk about Camp Corazon too, because it's a free camp for bereaved children. It's one of those things where, you know, if you go there as a volunteer or, you know, go there with your family, you can actually see a shift happen in just a few days when the kids are able to connect and relate with one another on a deeper level, realizing too that they may not have that opportunity to do that in their day-to-day environments. Why is that peer-to-peer connection so important for a child dealing with the loss of a sibling or a parent, you think?
Yeah. can I take a step back and just
Sure.
tell you a little bit more about this? Because did you know that in America there are over 450 grief centers? Some of them are clinically based. Some of them are peer-to-peer, the way that we do ours. Some of them are a mix of the two. We have a peer-to-peer model because kids are much more influenced by each other than they are by us as they're adults.
Which makes sense. Do you have any kids?
I don't. I wish I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it makes sense.
You've got, I heard that you might have a kindergartner.
Yeah, well, she'll be entering first grade really soon.
I'm excited for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole new chapter. But
It is.
But yes, peer-to-peer connection. Kids are influenced by each other. It makes sense.
Yeah, they're very influenced by each other, and kids will say what's honestly on their minds, sometimes to our chagrin. And sometimes kids will experiment and they'll say things that are unkind because they don't know any better yet. So Camp Corazon is a place where children can go and spend 3 days and 2 nights and be with peers who have experienced the same types of losses that they have. And they'll be able to undergo a transformative event. Like, have you ever been a part of Camp Corazon?
Yeah, I was a facilitator to a group of young teenage girls. I did a lot of work with like middle school and teenage girls years ago before I had my daughter, and that became a challenging childcare commitment weekly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been at Camp Corazon as well. Part of my new role is that I'm going to become the director of Camp Corazon next year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's going to be
Congrats.
thank you. I'm very excited. It's going to be in Torreon, New Mexico, which is just east of the Manzano Mountains, ages 7 through high school. It's going to be June 27th to 29. We do have limited spots, but we're hoping to get as many people from the state as possible because it's a volunteer-based camp where we get to participate in several bereavement groups, and the kids are going to be able to be in an environment where maybe for the first time they're with people who also know what it's like to lose a loved one. From the outside, it seems like a very common, typical camp. Like there's activities and games and people are having fun and people are getting wild with water, and like it's really an enjoyable experience. And then we couple that with these moments where we get to sit in a circle and connect and talk about what's going on. We always have someone who's an adult who's able to talk about these experiences and model what loss has been like for them. So the last 3 camps that I've been at, I was asked to be the sharing model. And when people can see you be vulnerable and understand that vulnerability is a strength and that talking about this doesn't harm anybody, talking about this can be really beneficial, and your presence here helps others. We get to live out our mission to help people by connecting with them because, you know, grief and attachment go hand in hand. And when someone is grieving, it's less understood, but we know that they're very motivated and they want something that they can't have. They want to be with their person. They want to be able to connect with them. And knowing that you can't is very painful, but being able to share that pain with others is what allows you to have a transformative experience and to take this pain that found you, share it with others, and then participate in what I think of as a collaborative healing model. Like, we are all there to help each other. Kids are so genuine and grateful, and they love being a part of this camp. I'm expecting almost everyone from last year's camp to come back, especially now that we're out of the heaviness of the pandemic. We're able to do overnight camps again and recruit more people and have more volunteers. And I'm hoping that we can do this camp more than once a year in multiple places in New Mexico because we have such opportunity to help bereaved people all throughout the state of New Mexico.
I just want to share a moment that struck me from my first Camp Corazon, a group of middle schoolers, because middle school is a tough age, right? You're already in a weird stage of life. You know, kids are maturing at different stages, you know, girls and boys. And then when you add, you know, a sudden and deep loss to a young person's life, that's just a whole other layer of complications, right? So my first Camp Corazon, there was an incident with a young boy who hid a hat of another camper, so like a ball cap. You know, innocent, fun the kids were having, but it turns out this hat, as it came out, was a special gift from the boy's father who had just died. And, you know, he had a deep reaction, and the campers were so good at just lifting this boy up. The kid who hid the hat was very remorseful, but I'm just thinking of like this for that to happen in an environment like this where the kids really do get it, they understood why this kid was so upset, and they not only dealt with it in a good, I think, communicative way, they helped this boy process of like why he was having such a negative reaction to the hat. And to me, that just like really opened my eyes of like, these kids are really learning how to be good friends and be really empathetic with one another. So highly recommend it if you, if this is something that you think you'd be interested in. But yeah, that just really struck me. And I wanted to talk about, how kids communicate too, because the age of technology, social media, smartphones, that's really changed the way that the youth interacts with one another to begin with. It's a conversation, school districts, teachers, parents are having, how much to allow their kids on social media. But I want to mention this to you again, because that human connection and the ability to be sitting in a room and give someone eye contact and have them listen to your story is just so different, I think, than any screen can provide. And we went through this in the pandemic where, counseling services were offered. Telehealth is a huge thing now. You can meet with a counselor on a Zoom call, but how do you as an educator measure the value of in-person resources versus virtual resources, especially, again, when you're dealing with children?
Yeah, first to name it, having resources is always better than having no resources. Like, yeah, telehealth is a great thing, but it's not the best thing. I would often call my students screenagers because it's like every chance they get, they just are on a screen. And it's something that was kind of introduced when I was a kid, and I always felt uncomfortable with cell phones, so I didn't have one even until college. But that's the exception. So many kids will get a connection through their cell phones and think that that's what identifies their needs and that they can get what they want from a cell phone. If it were possible to ban cell phones from classrooms, I think that our education would benefit, like our students' performance, and especially when it comes to how students communicate with each other during the day. There are things that we don't know that are going on that are very preventable. I wasn't expecting to talk about cell phones this much, but it's like, yeah, as a teacher, it's like, can we take these away? Because they're a useful tool, but they're also a distraction. And especially, like, I have heard so many stories as a bereavement facilitator who's been with all ages of kids talk about how hurt they were because an incident happened on a cell phone. And somebody might have posted something that they wouldn't say to someone's face. Because if I were to say to you something harmful, I would see the reaction and I would know, ooh, that's not a great thing to do. But sometimes when you post that online, you don't know how the other person's reacting. You're not getting an authentic measurement of how you are affecting someone's day. And it can completely submarine someone's day, especially if you post something harmful after they've had a loss. Because kids who have experienced a death oftentimes feel ostracized and isolated and lonely, and then the digital realm just amplifies that. Conversely, like, there are really good support groups. There's ways for teens to connect. I know that many of the young women at the previous Camp Corazon all made a commitment to have FaceTime every single Wednesday night so that they can keep supporting each other. I don't quite know how to navigate these pathways. I don't know. What do you know from your experience cell phones and talking with kids with cell phones?
Yeah, I mean, I think my husband and I are on the same page, like no social media until you're a teenager. And that's, maybe unpopular, but I think it should get more popular and parents should maybe have that conversation with each other too. But I'm curious too, from your experience, having been through the grief center through the pandemic when everyone went virtual versus back to in-person and everyone's pretty comfortable with that again. Is there a real difference, you think, from having in-person group, communications when you're talking about grief and, being able to reach over the table or play those grief games with the kids?
Yeah, it's really hard to play the M&M game online. So I facilitated a lot of teen groups online. And while we could prepare and say, like, we're going to do a scavenger hunt, so get ready to do this, and this activities to get kids moving and be a part of group, we did our best. And, I always tell my students, like, your best is good enough. It might not be your best ever, but I will always accept your best. Doing this in person is far and away optimal. And it's better because we are able to connect. We can go outside and play. The Grief Center is at the Center for Hope and Healing. We have a brand new playground, a basketball court, and so many activities that we can do together that we just couldn't access when we were online. As a teacher, teaching online was really difficult. While I would prefer to always be able to meet in person, having been on both sides of it, I just have seen the rate of education and healing after death and loss skyrocket compared to doing things virtually. So doing things in person just benefits all of us, and it helps us tap into our humanity. Like, human beings are able to support each other in profound ways more than any other living species in the history of the universe that we know of. Like, one of the things that makes us so powerful as just living beings is our ability to connect and support each other. And when we do that in person, I think that you get a sense of just how important we are to each other. And especially for someone who is experiencing loss and feeling disconnected, to have like-minded people there, physically present, able to support you, there's nothing better than it.
Yeah. So the Grief Center's longtime executive director, I want to mention Jade Richardson-Bach. She recently announced that she's stepping down after 21 years of service, which we know she played a vital role over the years. So this is a big deal for the organization, and the search for her replacement is still happening, correct? Mm-hmm. What can you share about that search and the executive director position?
Yeah, there's no replacing Jade. She is going to always be around in the Grief Center with her impact. There's no changing it. She has helped me so much, just personally, as well as professionally, like finding a job that I operate from a place of love. And I think it's okay to mention that we cannot replace Jade in everything that she's capable of doing. But I feel really confident in the next person who steps up and is ready to lead us, because when you understand the mission of the Grief Center and you're able to tap into all of the communities that need help, we are going to find someone who's incredibly strong and able to communicate and articulate the needs of children who are bereaved. And because we haven't found someone yet is okay, we're still interviewing, we are going to find someone who is phenomenal at this job, because we won't settle for anything less.
Okay. Has there been any particular story or person that's, I guess, struck you through this whole journey with the Grief Center and now as the director of education? What draws you so much to this kind of work? You mentioned, you get so much joy out of it, but it's like a little bit contradictory, right?
Yeah. You wouldn't think of grief and joy going hand in hand. Many ways they don't. For me, in my near decade of being a bereavement facilitator, it's the stories of meeting with young people and meeting with adults that have impacted me the most. So the Grief Center provides services from age 3 and up. I have taught a class there called Grief 101, but having facilitated with kids and understanding that they do want to be involved in the grief process, that oftentimes the hardest things for them are understanding, why didn't I get to be a part of the funeral planning for my dad? Why didn't I get to see his body? Why didn't I get to be included? That's what really struck me, is that they want to be a part of this process, and they did not feel protected when they were excluded. They felt lonelier. And knowing what they go through, and also having the chance to talk to adults, and many adults who have lost children and other things, the thing that really strikes me is that people want others to feel better. They don't know how yet. And children want to feel better, and they do so in so many different ways, like trying to support their parents and trying to support their living adults who are still with them. But they are so receptive to the guidance and information that we share at the Grief Center that it's just buoys my spirits, and it makes me really motivated to provide these services to people outside of Albuquerque, because we have a lot of resources here, and I want to make sure that everybody in New Mexico gets to experience what it's like to be a part of a group and undergo that healing process, because it's possible even when things feel impossible. Our big mission and vision at the Grief Center is to help people feel hope again. And being a part of groups where people take the depth of their experience and let out every single last emotion, and then take a deep breath in and keep going. And it's just, what motivates me is seeing people resume being able to dream again. Because when you're grieving, you are not able to have hope in that way. But I get to work with people and train people so that they help others to resume feeling hope.
Yeah, that's no small feat. Is there anything I'm missing that you like people either to understand better or just to know about?
Yeah, I just hope that people reach out to the Grief Center when they feel ready. To summarize everything I've been telling you, I think that being a part of the Grief Center and the grief community is being part of the most inclusive group that you would never ask to join. Like, I would prefer to have my brother back, but he died. But now that I am in this club and I realize that we are all here because we've lost someone, it unites us and it allows us to be part of this collaborative healing model. So even though you'd never asked to join this club, once you're here, there's nothing better.
Mickey Kivitz, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thanks again to Mickey Kivitz, the new Director of Education at the Grief Center, for taking the time to chat with me about the work that the Grief Center does here in New Mexico and the work that he plans to do in this new position to reach, children, students from even outside of Albuquerque and let them know the resources that are offered here. As he mentioned, New Mexico has some staggering statistics when it comes to violent crime, and also when you think about it in a familial sense, who that violent crime is impacting. But it might not be violent crime either. It could be medical. There are all kinds of ways that people are dealing with grief. So it's a good resource. We'll add some links here in our show notes if you're interested in some of the training and programs that they have to offer here. As he mentioned, they are free resources in New Mexico. If you have an idea for the podcast or someone you'd like to hear from, always feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening.